As you probably know, there's been some major Ubisoft news occurring over the last 24 hours or so, stuff that we also talked about in the second segment of the day yesterday, so if you saw that, you should be in the loop with everything. But just to recap super quick, AC Shadows has been delayed to February 2025. Ubisoft admits that Outlaws is underselling, and in a message released to investors, Ubisoft addresses a number of issues at the company and outlines some changes that they're going to try to help fix them. This following an internal probe also going on at Ubisoft to try and understand why the company has been failing so massively over the last number of years. And finally, Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot. Did I get the name right that time? Well, he's made a statement saying that Ubisoft really doesn't have an agenda, and this particular statement has actually enraged a number of armchair activists and similar type of journalists. That's what we're going to be going over in this video, as it should be very entertaining, so I hope you're ready, and let's enjoy. We start with Paul Tassi, who's responding to Stefan Totilo, who said, from CEO, regarding polarized comments around Ubisoft, I want to reaffirm that we are an entertainment-first company, creating games for the broadest possible audience, and our goal is not to push any specific agenda. We remain committed to creating games that everyone can enjoy. That being the statement from Yves that I mentioned earlier, and Paul Tassi responds saying, it is embarrassing, Ubisoft is admitting, that they're actually rattled by the culture war stuff over Outlaws and Shadows. He had more to say than that, but before we get to that, let me share my opinion on this. Just simplifying all of these issues into culture war stuff seems like a very odd take by Paul Tassi, because this situation involves people in Japan talking about their country being disrespected, as they're also lied to by a massive corporation regarding their own history. But apparently to Paul Tassi, all of this is just culture war stuff. Now, if you're not familiar with Paul Tassi, he's often been criticized in gaming circles for numerous takes that he's made over the years that seem dismissive of the issues people have with things such as DEI. For example, back when Ubisoft issued their apology to the Japanese community, Paul Tassi had this to say: when the hyper-forced pushback to your game is the not Japanese culture war talking point of you putting a DI samurai in your game, I would not engage with these people at all. So it also looks like he has a history of dismissing the issues that Japanese people have with AC Shadows. This is, of course, just one more example. I don't want to go through all this guy's tweets, just giving you a little bit more context. It's a truly bizarre thing how many armchair activist types and journalists, etc., are in complete denial about the failures of DEI. In my opinion, DEI is largely something that companies have tried to use for profit motives, attempts to appeal to ESG funds, and things like that. So whenever I see someone defending those sort of practices, to me, they just come off as massive corporate bootlickers. Now, as DEI has been failing and actually been costing these corporations more and more money in many cases, the topic comes up more and more. And we see more people criticizing that stuff, as well as more people like Paul Tassi seemingly attempting to dismiss those criticisms. Another example of this, albeit perhaps to a lesser extent, were some of the takes that he was making during Concord, where he seemed to be in denial of sorts about the game's terrible player count after launch, wondering if it was even just a glitch or something. It's like it's impossible for some people to admit the issues with the character roster, and how practices such as DEI largely contributed to a number of issues with the game. Now, I'm not saying that all of the issues with Concord were simply DEI related. For example, the price point in the saturated market, sure, these were also contributing factors to Concord's massive failure, but when you see people ignoring the DEI related issues as well, it comes off as ignorant or bad faith. And for those that don't know, the person Paul Tassi was talking to in those screenshots, Gene Park, who was also seemingly in denial in their own way, claims to be affiliated with the Washington Post. Anyways, back to the current news with Ubisoft and Paul Tassi's takes on this stuff going on right now. He added this to his other tweet, saying, Outlaws could have starred a guy who looks like Han Solo, and Shadows could have starred a guy who looks like Jin Sakai, and I do not think it would meaningfully change the fortunes of either of those games. I think this would be a larger contributing factor to AC Shadows. Star Wars Outlaws has a number of other issues aside from people just not liking the MC. For example, a lot of people said that the gameplay was just boring, especially the stealth segments, which is a large part of the game, and that you didn't feel all that much like an outlaw. Like, you were very limited in the so-called immoral stuff that you could do in the game itself. Of course, there's also been numerous glitches, and these are just a few brief examples of some of the issues that people have with Star Wars Outlaws. But for Paul Tassi to suggest that having an actual Japanese male lead for AC Shadows wouldn't meaningfully change the fortune of the game seems like an absolutely insane thing to say. And once again, it also seems dismissive towards the issues that many people in Japan, many Japanese people, have with the game. It's really odd that Paul Tassi seems to have a recurring theme where he's very dismissive towards the issues that Japanese people have towards AC Shadows. I do think there's other issues that AC Shadows has. I mean, there's clearly other reasons why Ubisoft delayed the game. the probability of them changing Yasuke at this point seems near 0%. So there's probably other things that they're trying to polish, which also falls in line with the other parts of the statement that they made. Also, as I mentioned yesterday, there's also just a general negative perception and a loss of goodwill that Ubisoft has had. So perhaps they're going to try and spend the next few months trying to recover some goodwill at least before releasing AC Shadows. The point I'm making here is there's other issues going on with AC Shadows besides just Yasuke. But again, Yasuke is certainly a huge factor. All of this leads us to an article that Paul Tassi wrote today for Forbes titled "After Assassin's Creed Shadows Delay, Ubisoft Acknowledges Outlaws Issue, Anti-Woke Pushback." It's funny that he complains about culture war stuff even when that label is oversimplifying the issues going on and is also, as I mentioned, rather dismissive towards the issues at large. But then he's also going to simultaneously write an article that's like, oh, it's just anti-woke pushback. Seems like this guy is actually propagating culture war stuff, if anything. The article goes over some of the stuff that we've already covered here in this video and others, so I'm skipping all that. And let's check out this section where he writes, "Then, Ubisoft surprisingly, tacitly acknowledged the narrative that its games have become too woke or agenda-driven, according to a segment of the internet." And posting that statement from Eves where he denies Ubisoft having any specific agenda. He then writes, "While Ubisoft already apologized to its Japanese audiences over some questionable promotional materials for Shadows, the pushback was also about the inclusion of Yasuke as one of the two leads, a legendary black samurai, where there was an ensuing debate of whether he was actually a samurai, and a stated idea that it shouldn't be starring him at all." It's pretty funny that despite all of the evidence coming out that Yasuke really wasn't conclusively a samurai, something that Ubisoft themselves has also admitted, here's Paul Tassi claiming he was not just a samurai, but a legendary one. He goes on to write, "There was similar pushback to Kay Vess leading Star Wars Outlaws as a woman, and a not attractive enough woman at that." So he's really not going to mention that the main issue here was that Ubisoft made her less attractive. Like, they went out of their way to make Kay Vess less attractive than the actress that she's based on. Something that's very bizarre and certainly worth pointing out, but hey, Paul Tassi ain't going to mention that part here. He then says, no historical accuracy complaints there, as it was pretty straightforward woke/DI talking points there, but it is surprising to see Ubisoft entertain this at all. There's another article I found that has very odd coverage, to say the least, regarding all this Ubisoft stuff. This one from fastcompany.com. The author Chris Morris writing, "Video game maker Ubisoft in chaos after anti-DEI backlash. The Assassin's Creed game maker delayed its biggest launch of the year, reduced forecasts, and is facing calls to sell in what is being called an incel victory." Okay, first of all, I haven't seen anyone say incel victory anywhere. Seems like this guy just made that up. And once again, I'll point out how these sort of people come off as such bigots, man. Dismissing the issues that Japanese people have with this game. Very reasonable and understandable issues. And then saying this is like an incel victory, seriously? These virtue signaler types are so hypocritical. And they're also just weird. I mean, who even talks like that? Oh, it's an incel victory. Like, either this guy made that up, or this must be some like terminally online Redditor talk here or something. Moving on. Because, spoiler alert, it's as bad in the article itself, or arguably even worse. He pulls out the classic, oh, the backlash is just from the far right. My gosh, these people are boring with their rhetoric, saying the same nonsense for years and years and years, and they wonder why people don't listen to them anymore. Check it out. Right here he says, "The bookings shortfall was technically due to the delay and disappointing sales of Star Wars Outlaws. However, the underlying reason for both of those, at least in part, is the far-right opposition to diversity and inclusion." Oh my gosh, what a joke. Yeah, diversity and inclusion, something that corporations love to gaslight people about. Oh, hey, we really care about this stuff. Not really. We just want money. But hey, if you criticize these corporations, you're apparently far right for criticizing corruption in corporations. He goes on to say, Outlaws, which has a female lead character, received mostly solid reviews from professional critics. Oh, professional critics. But many players gave it a 0 rating out of 10 on Metacritic, citing quote-unquote forced DI narratives, and claiming the developers, quote, spent more time on the woke culture than on the story and gameplay, unquote. Some players were also unhappy with the optional Season Pass model that tacked an additional $40 onto the game's price for extra missions. The review bombing, driven by anti-DI backlash, seemingly worked and set off a chain of events that led to Wednesday's announcement. I forgot to mention this. In the intro of the article, he says, Ubisoft abruptly canceled its appearance at the Tokyo Game Show and postponed all press previews of the upcoming Assassin's Creed Shadows. Wednesday, we learned why. Anti-DI backlash has sent the company spinning. So for one, as funny as that is, there's also a lot more going on with Ubisoft than the anti-DI stuff. Like, for example, they've been mismanaged heavily for years. But leave it up to this so-called journalist veteran to not acknowledge that, and to try and smear all of the Ubisoft critics as a bunch of far-right incels, as he seemingly attempts to defend this massive corrupt corporation. And that's about all that I have to say on this topic. Just truly bizarre stuff from these journalists. However, I suppose that's to be expected in this day and age, and part of why they're now such a disgraced profession. Let me know what you think about all of this stuff in the comments. As always, thank you so much for tuning in, and if you enjoyed my coverage, consider liking and or subscribing to the channel for more, and I'll see you in the next one.